Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the second weekend of January 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3, independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original, taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insights to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news from our Franklin News Foundation's Chalkboard News team. Today, we'll look at the wildfires in Southern California. We'll hear about President-elect Donald Trump's plans for Greenland and the Panama Canal, and we'll discuss New York City's congestion pricing system. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the devastating wildfires in Southern California, it's our Eliana Kernodle.
A variety of factors have contributed to devastating wildfires in Southern California. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's California reporter, Kenneth Schrupp. Kenneth, what is the current state of these fires and what natural factors contributed to these conditions?
Hey, Eliana. The fires, or the largest ones, are almost entirely uncontained. The Palisades and Eaton fires are each over 10,000 acres. The Palisades fires are nearly 20,000 acres as of a few minutes ago, both at 0% containment. We have two smaller fires a little bit north of the city that are 10 and 40% contained, respectively. And all of this has really come from a perfect confluence of extreme dryness after 2 years of record rain that created a lot of tinder and overgrowth that have now completely dried out. That was combined with hurricane-strength winds coming in from the desert. That is dry, hot air coming in and allowing any spark to become a major conflagration.
What assistance is Los Angeles getting to fight these fires?
Well, as many people know, Los Angeles and California step up and provide a lot of mutual aid whenever there are fires across the country. Now we're finally calling in those favors. Neighboring states, especially Arizona and Oregon, have sent in their state and even local firefighters and resources. We finally do have federal assets moving in now that the Biden administration has declared this a national disaster. However, one of the issues that we had was that the winds were so rough that we weren't able to deploy the air assets that we typically use to suppress any of these fires. Those include helicopters and airplanes that can fill up and drop entire tankers worth of retardant or water on a fire in a matter of seconds. Now that we have the air assets back online, the wind is dying down, it does seem like we can stop the advance of the fire, but until now, it's just been rolling essentially unstopped. We didn't have water pressure in the Palisades to continue fighting the fire. Unclear what the situation on the ground is in the east side of the city where the Eaton fire is, but firefighters are seeming like they're getting the situation under control.
There are some policies that are facing a lot of criticism for impacting the responses to these fires. What are they?
Well, number one was we did have a slight budget cut for the LA Fire Department this year under Mayor Karen Bass. We did cut the fire budget by about $17.5 million, I believe. We also, though, have not really conducted enough brush clearance. It does take several years on average to get permitting and approval to do controlled burns. The issue in California is we have a terrain called chaparral. This is just scrubland, low brush, low density scrubland that is really supposed to burn every few years. So in the absence of any forest management, if you adopt a policy of complete fire suppression, you have all these brambles, brush, dead trees that build up and become tinder for a fire. So if we're not doing prescribed burns, there was a California legislator who famously said, Well, if you don't carry it out, you're going to have to burn it out. And we're neither doing mechanical thinning, which is a removal of combustible material, or prescribed burns, which has meant that there's just complete fuel buildup. The city, apparently, I haven't confirmed this, may have stopped its hydrant testing due to some of the budget cuts. Making matters worse, we have had mass theft of hydrants for scrap metal value in the last year. We covered that hundreds of fire hydrants have been stolen, which, of course, is going to impact fire responses.
And what has President-elect Trump claimed about the fires?
Well, President-elect Trump has consistently pointed to California's water policy and California's forest management policy as the driver of the fires that we have here. Trump went ahead and has blamed Newsom for the policies that are fueling these fires. He said that Newsom has decided to limit the amount of water that we store and keep to protect a small fish called smelt. He's also talked about the need to conduct forest clearance, which we don't do. The U.S. Forest Service estimates that we have about 15 million acres of at-risk forest and land in California. The U.S. Forest Service also estimates it costs about $1,000 an acre to do brush treatment of some kind, whether that's physical clearance or burning. So, we're looking at a cost of $15 billion to eliminate all risk at once if we chose to do that. So deciding to spend money on a lot of other programs that are supposed to be for environmental reasons without really dealing with the biggest environmental challenge facing the state has many concerned about the allocation of resources in the state.
And while we're still in the midst of these terrible fires, even when firefighters get them under control, it won't be the end of the story. And we already know some of what may face homeowners in the aftermath. Can you get into that?
The state insurance market is completely been ruined by ongoing state policies. In California, the state regulator must approve any rate increases for insurance and also requires that insurance hikes be justified by historic values and historic numbers. And that doesn't really put into account current factors and potential higher values and risks. So the rate increases have been much lower than the increase in claims, which has led a lot of insurers such as State Farm to not even stop accepting new policies, but just say, we're not covering your house anymore. You need to go get insurance from someone else. They're just leaving the state. As a result, people have been pushed onto the state insurer of last resort called the FAIR plan. But there are a few issues with the FAIR plan. First, it only covers $3 million of property for protection. If you're living in somewhere like the Palisades, you might be seeing a median home price of $4.6 million. Your house is not really going to be totally protected, but that's just the material coverage. Let's just imagine that you do have a house where your value is fully covered by FAIR. Okay, well, FAIR only has $2.5 billion in reinsurance, which covers the payouts for its losses, and $200 million in cash. This fire is projected to cost tens of billions, if not over $100 billion. And the FAIR plan's $2.7 billion is not going to cut it. So where is all that extra money going to come from? There are two options. State regulators who have not been approving enough rate hikes and under whom FAIR is not allowed to pass on the cost of reinsurance to customers, so can't buy enough reinsurance. It would if it could. State regulators would have to approve an assessment onto all of the FAIR plan customers to cover the payouts from this. So you could see payouts taking a long time as assessments of maybe tens of thousands of dollars, or at least thousands of dollars, could be coming to every FAIR customer. This is a big problem because FAIR has gone from covering $50 billion of property in 2018 to $458 billion now. They just cover an extremely large amount of property without having enough money on hand. The other option is to get a bailout from the state. But the Legislative Analyst's Office just came out with a new report before the governor's new budget proposal saying that the state doesn't have any room for new financial commitments, which means that a bailout would have to come from Republican Congress. Given Governor Newsom's plans to file lawsuits to maintain the state's sanctuary state and even environmental policies, it's unclear if Republicans are going to give him the money to bail out the state for its failed environmental policies without making concessions on the immigration and environmental standards that Republicans have had issues with.
Well, Kenneth, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Kenneth. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on discussions of the future of Greenland and the Panama Canal, it's our Dan McCaleb.
President-elect Donald Trump has raised eyebrows with his fascination over the U.S. perhaps buying Greenland, taking back control of the Panama Canal, and inviting Canada to join the United States as its 51st state. Joining me to discuss this is Steve Wilson, regional editor for the Center Square. Steve, I think in particular, Trump's fascination with Greenland is a head-scratcher for many of our listeners, but he does have strategic reasons. Tell us why.
It's a twofold, actually a threefold thing. Number one, Greenland has vast reserves of rare earth materials, which, as you well know, are used in electric vehicles, semiconductors, other things. It's also got vast reserves of lithium, which is important for batteries, also important for power transmission lines. And it's got uranium. And there is the strong possibility that there is offshore oil in Greenland. So you've got a nice resource-based issue there. Also, all the great powers of the world now are focused on the Arctic. And obviously, Greenland is a big piece of real estate in the Arctic. During the Cold War, you had what was called the Guyuk, which was Greenland, Iceland, and Great Britain. And that was what they call a choke point, where the Soviet submarines would try to break into the Atlantic and do various mischief. And we had like sonar nets on the bottom of the ocean that are designed to protect that barrier. Having Greenland either under more U.S. control or expanded bases would be ideal for this great power competition.
The U.S. does have a base on Greenland. Is that correct?
They do. It used to be called Thule. It's been changed to an Inuit name that, unfortunately, I cannot pronounce.
I'm not even going to try it either, Steve, but how did that come about?
So during the Cold War, we needed a base to do several things. We needed to build a radar to detect Soviet ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, coming over the North Pole. And the best place to put it was Greenland. And they put it up there, and it's in the farther north part of Greenland, and they can only get a supply ship in there once a year. Also, they built a big runway there, big enough to handle our biggest strategic bombers. Because you remember during the Cold War, during the 50s and 60s, we would have planes on airborne alert. And the Strategic Air Command, which no longer exists, they had this concept of dispersing the bombers because they knew the Soviets knew where our bases were, and they were going to be priority targets. So they would disperse bombers out to Greenland. And of course, I don't think you have to tell Strategic Air Command veterans that they probably didn't want to go up there and have their bombers based out of that base.
You mentioned that other countries or the rest of the world has been focused on the Arctic. I think particularly you're talking about Russia and China, two adversaries of the United States. What's their fascination?
Well, the thing is, if you remember back in the day, I think it was Cabot, when he found Canada, was looking for the Northwest Passage. It's a shortcut. You go around the top of the world. I mean, you're taking a lot of time off shipping. And whoever controls that, if the ice pack can lift enough it can shrink enough to where they can actually get ships in there, have icebreakers go through, which is one of the reasons we need more icebreakers. You can actually send cargo ships going through there, oil tankers. You're saving money. You're saving time. It's such an important area. And also the Arctic is very rich in like minerals, probably oil wealth. I mean, you know all about Alaska. I think this could be a game changer, but I think it's also a negotiating tactic. I don't think we're going to buy Greenland. I don't think we have the money. And I don't think the Danes would sell Greenland to us, but I think this is a start low, go high type negotiating tactic from President-elect Trump.
You mentioned the Danes. Greenland currently is an autonomous territory of Denmark. So you think this is a negotiating tactic to just gain leverage on Denmark, to have Denmark, okay, we're not going to sell Greenland to you, but we will allow the U.S. to, build another base or what?
Well, it's interesting. It would probably take hundreds of billions of dollars to build the base like they have now that they built in the 50s. And it took a Herculean effort. I mean, we're talking Panama Canal worthy effort to build that base up north. But what I think Trump's aim is, he wants to get more mining contracts so we can get in on those rare earth materials, which, as you well know, everything has microprocessors. We're going more towards electric cars for good or for ill. And we need those materials. China has most of them, but if we had Greenland where we could mine some, we could be more of a player in this field. And not to mention the oil, the uranium, the lithium. That's a huge thing as well.
You mentioned the Panama Canal. In the brief amount of time we have left, Steve, the U.S. once controlled the Panama Canal. The U.S. built the Panama Canal. The late President Jimmy Carter, who we just laid to rest yesterday. Again, we're recording this on Friday, January 10th. Buried yesterday, died in late December. He gave away the Panama Canal, but now Trump wants it back. Just briefly tell us why. What's the strategy there?
Well, the Chinese have built some infrastructure down there, and I think that it's a strategic point, just like Greenland. And we need to secure it in some way. I think what he's trying to do is, we're not going to invade Panama like we did in 1990. But I think what's going to end up happening is we're going to get more American companies to get contracts in there. And this is the start of negotiations, just like with Greenland.
Steve, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Big thanks to Dan and Steve. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on the new congestion pricing just implemented in New York City. It's our Dan McCaleb.
New York's controversial new congestion pricing system is now underway in the Big Apple. Commuters entering Manhattan below 60th Street will pay inflated tolls in what officials say they hope will reduce tailpipe emissions. But the new tolls have a fair share of critics. Joining me to discuss this today is Sarah Roderick-Fitch, regional editor for the Center Square. Sarah, explain to our listeners what this congestion pricing scheme is all about.
Well, it has actually been in talks for several years now, going back multiple mayoral administrations in New York. And it was actually, it was planned to go ahead with it. And then in June, Governor Kathy Hochul put a pause on it, which it seems pretty clear it was sort of for political purposes, because it was very unpopular with a lot of Republicans in districts surrounding New York and Long Island. There were some competitive districts there. So it was put on hold at the time. And then right after the election, then it was lifted. But it was initially, I think it was going to be $15. And then she lowered it to $9. However, it is going to go up incrementally. I think by 2031, it'll be $15, kind of the base of it for cars. And this is during these are peak times. I believe it's 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. during weekdays and weeknights. And there's certain breaks and whatnot in place for people with low income and how much you travel it. But it had also not just Republicans who were outraged by this, but there was a lot of Democratic pushback, including New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy. New Jersey had tried multiple lawsuits. They were against it. So their lawmakers were very much against it. There were some other Democrats in New York that were against it. But ultimately, really what the problem is, and where this is stemming from, is low ridership with MTA within Manhattan's, their transportation authority. And they have about a $33 billion budget gap that they need to fill. And that's kind of where a lot of that's where that money is coming from. And low ridership and all of these, they need upgrades and whatnot for not just the subway system, but also busing and whatnot. And so this is sort of expected to bring in, I think, they're hoping to bring in about $15 billion to sort of to close that. In addition, they're trying to increase ridership because they're trying to put people back, pushing them back into the, subway and bus systems, which there has been a little bit of an uptick since it took place. So there's a couple reasons why it's not just about congestion and emissions. It's a bit of a money grab. Yes, it's definitely a money grab. It's definitely certainly a money grab, and they really haven't I mean, that really honestly hasn't been, they haven't been hiding that fact, really. They made it very clear that this is one of the reasons why they need it. Of course, one of the reasons to say is, because of environmental reasons, congestion and tailpipe emissions and whatnot. But really, it's the main reason is money.
So commuters entering Manhattan, for the right to get to Manhattan, whether it's for a job, for a tourist who just is visiting, you have to pay $9 every single time you enter Manhattan. You mentioned New Jersey's governor legally challenging it. I can't imagine these commuters, whether you're coming in from New Jersey or Maryland or Connecticut or what have you. Mm-hmm. They're very happy about it. Particularly if you work, if you live in one of those regions and you work in Manhattan, you've got to go to work every single day. That's $9 a day. That's like nearly $50 a week.
Yes. And that's the sort of the starting point. If let's say you're a business, you have a business and you have, you have a truck, you need to, take supplies in or whatever each day, you're going to be paying up to, $21 going in. So, I mean, it hurts, a lot of places because, you've got ports and whatnot, especially on the Jersey side that, you have to bring stuff in, into Manhattan, you have to import stuff. So yeah, it does hurt them. But also another fact, where there's been pushback too is within writers, not just the expense of it, but now it's sort of pushing people, to ride the subways and there's
those are safe, right? No problem with New York subways.
Yes. Subway stations, just a few weeks ago, the woman was tragically burned alive on one of the subway cars there. And there's video of it, and even one of the police officers just kind of walked by. I mean, there's been several issues, and in that same time frame, a gentleman was just standing there and he was pushed onto the tracks. Miraculously, actually ended up surviving. But these are things that have been happening on the subway, not to mention that case where that chokehold, Daniel, I think it was Daniel Penny, that there's been so many instances of violence and then, with homelessness and everything else, in the subways that has been a major issue. And so Republicans, some of the critics have brought that up too, is saying, well, you got to make the subway safer. People are not happy about that as well, as they're just not feeling safer. Although Governor Kathy Hochul and Eric Adams maintain that crime is going down, it's safer, but I think it's really difficult to calm sort of some of these concerns because of these instances that have happened. I mean, they've been so publicized and, that's really frightening. So when you hear, especially you have tourists, they're coming in or, maybe they may not want to ride the subways, because of that. It's been very challenging trying to sell this, I think, with people. And President-elect Trump has been very much against it. And he is saying that he's going to, when he gets into office, that he is going to try to nix the whole plan. I'm not exactly sure how he can do that, but this was approved through the Department of Transportation. So perhaps he can have some leeway with that. But we'll see if he's successful in doing that.
Sarah, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Sarah for that update. That'll do it for the first half of the Center Square Radio Hour. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. What did former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan have to say on the stand in his high-profile corruption trial? What states passed school choice measures in 2024, and what's in store for 2025? And is there truly a housing shortage? All that and more will return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting that you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. Former President Jimmy Carter was commemorated Thursday at a state funeral at the Washington National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., attended by President Joe Biden and other dignitaries. His body was then returned to his hometown of Plains, Georgia, where he is to be buried. Carter was U.S. President from 1977 to 1981. He died December 29th at the age of 100. The U.S. Senate is set to vote on the Lincoln-Riley Act, a bill that empowers law enforcement to detain and deport illegal immigrants accused of crimes, after the House passed it 264 to 159 on Tuesday. The legislation would require U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement to detain for deportation any migrant residing illegally in the U.S. who is charged with violent crimes as well as burglary, theft, larceny, or shoplifting. Meta is ending its fact-checking program in the U.S. and replacing it with a system similar to the one used by the X platform. Meta, the parent company of Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, announced the policy overhaul and assured the platform would work with the incoming administration and return to the company's foundational values and roots. Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers says he doesn't understand why Milwaukee Public Schools continue to ignore a state law that requires them to return school resource officers to school buildings. Evers said he wants the city's school district to comply with the law that required 25 resource officers in school buildings by January 2024. Milwaukee public school leaders continue to blame the city's police department for not paying for or training the officers. Milwaukee police, they are continuing with good faith negotiations with the city's schools, but there hasn't been much progress. A Texas-based group is fronting a lawsuit against Minnesota that challenges the state's failure to recognize other states' firearm permits. The Liberty Justice Center filed the suit in the U.S. District Court of Minnesota on behalf of 2 truckers licensed to carry in Texas, Florida, and Georgia who believe they should also be able to carry a firearm for self-defense in Minnesota. According to Liberty Justice Center, Minnesota decides each year which state firearm permits it will recognize. Currently, it does not recognize permits from Texas, Georgia, Florida, or 26 other U.S. states. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on defendant Michael Madigan taking the stand, it's our Dan McCaleb.
In a development that surprised many, longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan took the stand in his own corruption trial this week, testifying that he did not participate in any, quote, quid pro quo during his leadership days in Springfield. Joining me to discuss this is Greg Bishop, Illinois Associate Editor for the Center Square. Greg, let's start with the fact that Madigan actually took the stand in his own defense. This surprised me. How about you?
Yeah, you just remember, Dan, a few weeks ago, we were talking about the prospect of whether or not Madigan would testify. This was, of course, after 10, 11, or 12 weeks of the prosecution presenting all of their witnesses, calling former state representatives, current state representatives, displaying all kinds of emails and documentation, and even airing in open court Madigan's voice on undercover recordings via video and wiretap phone calls. So Madigan's voice was heard in the court, but it was only from those various phone calls and recordings. And the prospect of whether Madigan would testify, somebody who's not a lawyer but has watched some criminal proceedings and various other court proceedings, sometimes it's not recommended that those who are the defense actually take the witness stand, because it opens them up to a whole host of other, some could see challenges in trying to defend their case. Because it's not just when somebody who's the defense gets on the witness stand answering questions from a friendly, like their defense attorney. It opens them up to the prosecution during cross-examination. So a lot of scuttle happened earlier this week when there was some rumblings that there was going to be a big development. And our reporter, Jim Talamonte, was in the courtroom monitoring the trial. And he's been there for the duration of this in assistance with Brett Rowland as well with the Center Square. And then we found out, indeed, Madigan was going to testify, which was a huge surprise. And Jim said that the courtroom filled up even on that day. Earlier this week, several members of Madigan's family were there that hadn't been there before. So it was clearly a big breaking news development that the longest serving state house speaker in U.S. history was taking the witness stand in his own corruption trial. Now, only the defense has presented their side, having Madigan discuss his upbringing, his early childhood with his family, and talking about his marriage to his wife, and even adopting Lisa to be his daughter, Lisa Madigan, the former Illinois Attorney General. They discussed that. But we have yet to get to the point, Dan, and people are anxiously anticipating what's going to happen come Monday when the jury's back in, and you've got the prosecutors who are going to have their chance to cross-examine the former House Speaker. So how he's going to handle that, we'll have our eyes and ears in the courtroom with Jim Talamonte and Brett Rowland.
Yeah, no court today in honor of former President Jimmy Carter's funeral procession, which is going on both in Washington, D.C., and then his burial in his hometown in Georgia. And Friday has been an off day for jurors. Some days, attorneys get with the judge to argue about what can be admitted to evidence, go over jury instructions and stuff like that. So the prosecution will not get an opportunity to cross-examine Speaker Madigan until Monday, but that's when it gets interesting, Greg, because who knows? One of the things, defendants often don't testify on their own behalf because they don't want to be caught lying under oath. That would be a crime in and of itself. Not saying Madigan lied, with no idea. But when the prosecution gets a hold of them and can start asking questions that Madigan might not be prepared for, that's when it gets interesting, don't you think?
Yeah, you can imagine that the prosecution team, again, the federal government, with the charges they brought against Madigan and co-defendant Mike McLean, they're probably putting in 40 hours just over the weekend in preparing for Madigan to testify. There's no doubt they always thought, it's possible Madigan could testify, right? These are seasoned prosecutors. They've been through their fair share of criminal proceedings, and they know how sometimes defendants don't want to testify, and that's their right. Defendant has absolutely every right in the U.S. Constitution to not testify. But surely they were thinking, well, we got to be prepared just in case Madigan does want to testify. So as the sidebars were happening, discussing Madigan taking the witness stand, I'm sure prosecutors were already lining up all of the workload that they were going to have to put in over this weekend to prepare for the expectation of being able to ask Madigan questions while he's under oath.
You referenced his co-defendant, Michael McLean. They've been standing trial together since the beginning of October. Former colleagues and friends, close friends, not anymore though. And it was clear during questioning of Michael Madigan that's no longer the case. Before the trial started, McLean's attorneys actually filed a motion to try and seek to have them tried separately because they feared Madigan might put all of the blame for any potential wrongdoing on McLean. Anyway, during questioning of Madigan, it was clear that they're no longer tight as they used to be. What was one of the questions? Carter, the attorney, one of the defense attorneys asked if McLean was a master of understanding House rules and how things worked in Springfield. Madigan's response was, Mike knew his way around, but you shouldn't elevate him that high, Madigan said. So anyway, this case gets really interesting beginning Monday. Any idea how long prosecutors will cross-examine him? Will it be the full day? Will it be multiple days? I guess we don't know.
I fully anticipate it's going to take several days for the prosecution team. I don't think it's just going to be one prosecutor raising questions. It could be several. But again, Madigan opened himself up to cross-examination by being willing to testify. And one thing that we've seen so far with how Madigan's defense team's been asking Madigan questions, it feels that Madigan's defense team is trying to put a lot of this on McLean. Right. For instance, Madigan said that he didn't know that some of the allies and associates were getting do-nothing job contracts, and saying that, well, they should have worked, and saying that McLean, he'd often, rely on McLean to take care of certain things, but wasn't aware of McLean, how he would go about taking care of these particular requests, and also saying, listen, job recommendations are a regular occurrence when it comes to, government officials and some of their allies looking for work, and knowing their experience, being able to make those recommendations. But some of the line of questioning and the responses of Madigan indicate that he seems to be putting this on McLean.
And listeners can keep up with all developments in the corruption trial of former House Speaker Michael Madigan at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Dan and Greg. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on the developments of the school choice movement over the past year and what's to be expected in the year to come. It's Aureliana Kernodle.
While many states expanded and adopted school choice programs in 2024, some advocates are excited about new education opportunities for families in 2025, made possible because of this year's election results. Joining me to dig into this story is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, what states created or expanded school choice programs in 2024?
Yeah, it's a great question. I spoke with Ed Tarnowski, who is the policy and advocacy director at EdChoice, and he's got an eagle eye for, what happened in 2024, and I think a really good idea about what's going to happen in 2025 regarding school choice measures. And he told me that 5 states created new school choice programs. So he said Alabama got a universal eligibility program, which means that every student who applies can get access to that school choice program. Some states are not universal in that they have like a need-based. So that's just an interesting distinction there. Louisiana got a program with universal eligibility. Georgia passed an education savings account program that has limited eligibility. So then Tarnowski also told me that Nebraska created a new program, but it was overturned by a ballot measure in November. And Tarnowski said that it's essentially defunct, but that was technically one of the 5. And he also said Wyoming created a new program, their first education savings account, or ESA. So that's usually where there's a option for some, if it's a limited, or all, if it's universal, students to get some taxpayer money for these educational expenses, whether that's tuition or different kinds of, qualifying expenses. And then the expansions were in Indiana, Missouri, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Utah, and North Carolina. And specifically Utah, that was a big expansion, Tarnowski told me, because of the state's program funding. It doubled the number of students who were eligible for the program, so he talked very highly of how, that was a big change. In North Carolina as well, Tarnowski said that the legislature overrode the governor's veto on legislation to expand its school choice program. So they passed legislation to expand it. Governor vetoed it, and then there was an override. So these are the kind of the dramatic school choice shifts that we've seen in some states. And, that's something that Tarnowski pointed to during the election as well. So he pointed to New Hampshire and how Republicans made universal school choice, a big issue, and then saw the benefit of that in the state capitol. And same thing too in Texas. That's something that we've written about a little bit at Chalkboard News, but it kind of gets more into the politics side of it, almost of how these school choice issues can play out in political coverage and in terms of these political races, and that a lot of the school choice proponent candidates backed by Governor Greg Abbott there in Texas, they did well, and they beat out Republicans or Democrats. Republicans in the primaries, and I think Democrats at the polls in November. And so that's very interesting to see that. And Texas is a very interesting state too, because you had a lot of Republicans against school choice because of, these rural school districts that did not want their money to go toward other school choice options, essentially. So it's a very interesting kind of example there in Texas to see how that played out politically for some of these candidates. So those are the, big states that created new programs or had some of those expansions there.
And what is he expecting in the year to come?
Yeah, as I mentioned with Texas, I think Tarnowski was very, very bullish on school choice in Texas, and he said that would be a huge, huge win because of the size of Texas. And I think that's something that's very interesting to point out too, is a lot of people have moved to Texas in recent years. Like they have had a lot of population growth, at least specifically in some areas too. And I think that it is just a big state. So one of those that if they had like a school choice program or a universal school choice program, it would, increase the number of students who are eligible for school choice programs by a lot. So I think for Tarnowski and other people who are big proponents of school choice, they're very excited to see Texas moving and trending toward that direction. And I think you could see what, critics in Texas or critics of school choice saying, we have to do everything we can now to try to step in here and slow this down or try to come up with some limitations. And that was, a big point of contention in Texas, during some of the special sessions on school choice. And it's a big back and forth, right? This is a niche issue in terms of all policy. The school choice and different education savings accounts, but then it becomes very emotional very quickly. People start voting with their feelings, start getting very heated about that and this debate. So I think it's interesting to kind of keep it at such a high level because you're sort of removed from some of those states and local issues. You're sort of far away from the district level, right? Because you're at this kind of this top perspective. Another couple of states that Tarnowski's watching this year, that EdChoice is watching, is Tennessee, Idaho, North Dakota, and South Carolina. So these are all states where you could see different kinds of programs, different kinds of shifts in school choice and the program there. So it's just something to look at. And, again, this is the high level, and some of these are, creating for example, a limited availability or limited eligibility education savings account, or there are programs that are sort of they provide a tax credit for these scholarships, and so then the scholarships can go to students. And again, it's a limited eligibility. It's not universal eligibility, and it's not really taxpayer money because it's citizens saying I'm going to donate to that with the tax credit essentially. So it's a very interesting sort of landscape out there for school choice.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Brendan for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Join me to discuss the economics behind the housing crisis and why we talk about it the way we do. It's PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O, greetings in this new year. Piece of information that came out of Cato, the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., all about the housing market and housing data.
And look, I thought this Cato piece was really interesting, but I'm not even sure why they wrote it, though, is I guess my big, so in this article, right, the first thing is I call it quibbling over semantics. It's a couple young policy folks writing about, what it means to have a housing shortage. What does it mean to have a shortage in the marketplace? Well, usually shortages arise from the price of a good or services being fixed artificially too low. And if you have a price that is fixed too low, and the price is not able to adjust to supply and demand conditions, then you have too high demand relative to supply. And that results in what we call a shortage in economics, right? So at a given market price, you fix the price, you have too much demand relative to supply, usually because the price is way too low. And so producers have no incentive to come into this marketplace and actually produce widgets in order to meet demand, right? In the housing market, we don't have that, right? We don't have that. Prices have been rising over time, and they've been rising pretty fast. Right? Yes. The price is not artificially too low. Prices are rising very fast, and people just can't afford homes. A lot of people just struggle to afford housing, right? And so no, you don't have a shortage in the technical sense of the word, but what you have is more families needing housing, potentially living with other people that are not related to them. Then you have available housing across the country. So don't call it a shortage, call it something else. Call it a deficit. Call it whatever you want to call it. In fact, what they do in the Post is they write about a paper, an academic paper that was written just a couple years ago in 2022, where the authors say explicitly in their paper, they say, of course, economists do not typically use the term housing shortage to express the quantity reducing effects of supply constraints. While prices may be artificially elevated, any buyer can generally purchase a home at the market price. We nonetheless follow popular discourse and abuse economic terminology. Call it an abuse of terminology, but does it mean that there isn't a big deficit of housing in this country? No, we still have a massive deficit. There are lots of families waiting for the opportunity to own a home, and they can't do it. They can't do it not just because the price is super high. They can't do it not just because mortgage rates are elevated. They can't do it because even if they had the money, the resources, on hand today, there's just not enough housing to go around for everyone in this country, right? I looked at the number of families living in the United States, and I compared it to the number of available units back last year in 2023, because that was the latest, we're at 25 now, in 2023. And the gap was huge, something like 4.5 million homes. Okay. So we would have to build 4.5 million homes to make sure we had enough housing available for every family that's out there. Every family. Right?
In this moment.
Exactly.
So, algorithmically, like how many houses do we have to build, to, in theory, catch up with this, the housing issue that we have nationally? And how long does it take to build a house, right?
Exactly. It takes
you
about,
just go like that and the house shows up.
It takes 6 to 8 months to build a house that, from the time it's started to completed, but we're behind. This past year, we've built what, about 1 million homes, right? If the deficit was 4.5 million homes in 2023, and we've had a big surge in immigration and we've built 1 million homes, chances are the gap probably got larger in the past year. Okay. So this is the reality. And we can, like I said, we can quibble about the terminology we use, right? But ultimately, economists are not there to just talk about economics in this, in a bubble. They're here to make sense of things for everyday people. And that's what we do on this podcast. We're trying to make sense of things for everyday people. If you're an economist and you don't think this is, the word shortage should be used, that's fine. I agree with you because I'm an economist and I understand what a shortage is. But at the same time, we're using terminology that, people can actually easily digest. And that's what we did. And I think most industry experts have done the same thing, but this piece, I think unfairly criticizes some of the work that's been done simply because it used the terminology shortage, the word shortage. Look, I have friends at the Cato Institute. They're wonderful people. I used to be an intern at Cato when I was younger, actually. Yeah. Spent some time there, right? But ultimately, I think this piece kind of misses the mark. We have to talk about the issues, right? And we have to talk about the issues in a way that everybody can easily understand. And we should not be out there confusing things for people, right? And you put this headline out there and people get confused, right? And it distracts from talking about the real issue that's out there, which is that there are rules in place, restrictions to builders that are preventing the supply response that is necessary in the marketplace to make sure everyone who wants to live out on their own has a home of their own.
Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. Rowe. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. The Center Square Radio Hour is a production of America's Talking Network, produced by Eliana Kernodal. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it at americastalking.com. I'm Chris Krug on behalf of everyone at Franklin Davis Foundation. Thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.